The aim of Childhood Recollections has been to explore the relationship between memory and design through a process of interviewing 6 outstanding designers in architecture and fashion, and then recollecting their memories in the context of their work through photographs, text, materials, objects, film, books, music, and scent. The exhibition design by Mensen is conceived as 6 cabinets of curiosities. And for me as a curator, each cabinet has been like one of those magical boxes which you open up to reveal another smaller box and then another and another. So there are stories within stories and layers beneath layers, really intimate narratives intersecting with world history and dialogues between art forms and different disciplines. As Zaha Hadid said in her exhibition text, there should be no boundaries. And this has also been the philosophy behind the multisensory displays. So you will find an early 1950s corset, photographs of a salt mine near Krakow, and the Yiddish actress Ida Kaminska, a 1920s accordion with sparkling diamanti, and a jazz trumpet, all sitting together in the context of Daniel Libeskind's architecture. There is something very immediate about Daniel's childhood recollections. He remembers with the eyes, ears, and sensibilities of a child, as Denise Scott Brown and Kengo Kuma, for example, also do. There is also a love of freedom and imagination in Daniel's words and in his work, which, as he says, comes from lived experience, not just from theory. This ability to remember with all the senses is very present in the 2 beautiful sketches that he's made for the exhibition. And one is his memory of arriving by boat, by immigrant boat, in New York in 1959. So I hope later you'll all have a look at his sketches. To be a child of Holocaust survivors in the grey textile city of Łódź in Poland, which housed the 2nd largest Jewish ghetto in the Second World War, is to be conscious of death from a very early age. Death as absence, or as Daniel says in his exhibition text, death as a void. This personal memory of death found expression in his Jewish museum in Berlin. And he would go on to become the master planner of the World Trade Center site after 9/11. This connection between childhood memory and creativity and memory and death, which is the subject of the exhibition currently on show at the Sir John Soane's Museum, suggested the idea of this joint event with Daniel, who's very kindly flown in from Berlin for this evening. Before I hand over to the Soane curator, Dominique Jenkins, I just want to read you a quote by the Argentinian writer Borges, which is at the entrance on the door to Childhood Recollections, and which I think is particularly apt in the context of Daniel Libeskind's work, and perhaps his legacy too. All things have been given to us for a purpose, and an artist must feel this more intensely. All that happens to us, including our humiliations, our misfortunes, our embarrassments, is given to us as raw material, as clay, so that we may shape our art. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'd just like you to take a moment to transport yourself away from this fabulous interior to Sir John Soane's Museum, and in particular, wonderful gallery spaces that we have there. The exhibition that we have on at the moment, Death and Memory, Soane and the Architecture of Legacy, commemorates the 200-year anniversary of Eliza Soane, John Soane's beloved wife's death. She died on the 22nd of November, 1815. Here we are, 200 years later, looking at various ideas for exhibitions, and it seemed incredibly appropriate to use that as our starting point. So the exhibition really looks at Sir John Soane in the context of death and memory and legacy, both in his personal and professional life. The exhibition is split into a number of themes. These focus on the Soane family tomb, which is about half an hour's walk from the Soane Museum, so do take the time to go there if you have a moment. Other areas that we've looked at include the relationship between Soane and his family, particularly that of his relationship with his sons and in a little more detail that with his wife. We've also looked at the Soane Museum itself, a number of lecture drawings that Soane created when he was professor at the Royal Academy. At the Soane Museum we have about 1,000 of these lecture drawings, so we're really only able to show a very small number of these at the gallery itself. We also have a number of works on display that really give you an insight into Soane as a collector, Soane as a man wanting to leave a legacy to the nation as part of his collection, which I believe are about a third of the 30,000 drawings that we have at the Soane. We have works from Nicholas Hawksmoor to William Chambers to Flaxman, Robert Adam, and we have a number of those really exciting works on display in the gallery. I just wanted to mention very briefly a couple of the pieces that are on show specifically. The first of which is a rather beautiful drawing. It's in the sort of mini installation that we've done on the Soane family tomb, and this is a rather crude drawing in Soane's own hand of an Ouroboros, that is a serpent swallowing its own tail. Soane wraps this around the drum of the tomb that sits atop the canopy, and it's an ancient symbol for eternity. These sorts of symbols, if you've been to the Soane or if you come and see the exhibition, are replete. You can't take a turn without seeing something that is connected to death and memory. In that same case, exploring the Soane family tomb, we also have this wonderful, rather picturesque view of the tomb. Now, the tomb is set at St Pancras churchyard, which would never have looked as green as it does in this wonderful romanticised version, with a huge number of trees around it. It looks rather like a parkland, so very different to the reality. In the distance to the right of this drawing, you can just about make out Jean-Jacques Rousseau's tomb. What this really says about Soane is that he is trying to associate himself with this wonderful philosopher that he so admired, but also to connect himself to somebody who felt persecuted in the same way that Soane did. Another of the sort of key highlights in the exhibition is an object we call Death Blows. Now, this was two articles that were written by Sir John Soane's son, George Soane. George Soane went to prison, debtor's prison, and unfortunately for him, his parents refused to bail him out. So, as you might imagine, he came out of prison and rather angrily penned two articles, which were then published in the Champion newspaper, anonymously, I might add. Now, when Eliza Soane read these two articles, she knew immediately that they were George's, and she said, "He has given me my death blows." Now, Eliza was very sick on reading these articles, and in fact she died less than 6 weeks later. John Soane never forgave her and blamed her death entirely on him. I just wanted to read a fragment from Death Blows just to give you a little bit of an insight into their relationship. He steals a bit here and a bit there, and in piling up these collected thefts, he imagines he has done the duty and earned the honours of an artist. Depraved as is the present taste, such follies will not pass for wisdom. The public laugh at these extravagances, which are too dull for madness and too mad for the soberness of reason. The most extraordinary instance of this perversity of taste and dullness of invention is to be found in this artist's house in Lincoln's Inn Fields. The exterior, from its exceeding heaviness and monumental gloom, seems as if it were intended to convey a satire upon himself. It looks like a record of the departed, and can only mean that, considering himself as defunct in that better part of humanity, the mind and its affections, he has reared this mausoleum for the enshrinement of his body. The interior of this building forms a ludicrous contrast with its external appearance. The passages glow with the deepest red. The lower room, which occupies the whole length of the building, is converted into a library, a second satire upon the possessor, who must stand in the midst of these hoarded volumes like a eunuch in a seraglio, the envious and impining guardian of that which he cannot enjoy. So Soane goes on to actually display these in the drawing room at number 13, Lincoln's Inn Fields, with a little note below them saying, by George Soane, death blows. So you can imagine the sort of impact that that might have on visitors coming to the Soane. He was later talked into moving Death Blows to the personal apartments upstairs. So that's really all I wanted to say about the exhibition, just a little bit of an introduction. And I now hand over to Daniel and Gillian.
Thank you.
Well, let's strike a lighter note.
I do, it's great. Zaha Space, Soane, it's fantastic.
And of course, you've exhibited at the Soane Museum, but
yes,
we'll
for sure.
come
I had
around
a
to
good
that.
fortune to, yes. I love the museum, yes.
I'd rather like to
And I didn't know those amazing texts, wow.
They're kept quite... I'd like to start at the beginning of your recollections in this exhibition, and very moving they are, and particularly the drawing. Can you sort of describe the drawing? Can you describe your feelings when you were approached to look at your own childhood memories for the purposes of this exhibition?
I thought it was a very strange exhibition and very interesting one, because usually you go to an exhibition, you see products, you see renderings, models, and so on. So it's kind of a private sort of cabinet of something. And really, I thought a lot about it when the exhibition theme came, because one seldom thinks of one's own childhood, explicitly, thematically. But it certainly evoked, I never drew my view of New York as I arrived. And I realized that to me, when I was an immigrant to New York, and I have to tell you the story because I was probably one of the last immigrants to arrive by boat. In the late 50s, still immigrants came by boats. By 1960, the airplanes were much cheaper, so everybody flew to Kennedy. But I was lucky to have that experience of kind of the mythology of New York, which is arriving by boat as an immigrant, woken up 4 o'clock in the morning by my mother, and with my sister, go up, you're gonna, wake up, you're gonna see New York. And you stand on the deck, and really there's nothing to prepare you for it, even though you're 13 years old, and you've seen movies, you've seen pictures, postcards, nothing to prepare you for the feeling of an immigrant, seeing that skyline. It's just something impossible to explain, because it's a phantom which is real. You kind of look at it, it's not a believable skyline, but the power of seeing it from the water, from a boat that has been on the waters for so many, for weeks. And then I did see that Statue of Liberty. I tried to draw it as big as I could because it was so big. I've been with tourist boats subsequently, around the Statue of Liberty, and it looks like a normal, statue next to, Manhattan. But to me, it seemed just a gigantic thing that turns. And I think it was meant by the great sculptor to be seen from the boat. I think the views from Manhattan are not so good. It's really from the boat as you come. And then I had that feeling that my life had changed just at that moment. It's kind of it's a 13-year-old boy doesn't really think about life in that way. But I just had that deep feeling. And I didn't even know the words of Emma Lazarus, the poet, American Jewish poet, which are on the Statue of Liberty, which is, give me the poor, give me the thing, the people who have been thrown out, who are not wanted anywhere, bring them here to us where they can breathe free. So, it formed my experience of America was formed just right then and then, and it's irreversible. no matter how much I read about the Republican candidates and how horrible things are happening in our country, that's kind of supersedes it.
I rather like the idea of the various places that you secreted yourself in childhood. I like the cardboard boxes. I like the idea of that. And then you talk about the salt mine, the salt caves, which I've been to outside Krakow, which are sort of both incredibly dark and incredibly sort of crystalline, sparkling, light sort of at one remove.
Yes. Well,
I mean, it seems to me you had a very, very rich sort of set of references.
Well, it was
long before New York.
It wasn't really chosen. When I grew up in a city, when I say Łódź, Lodz today, today it's a gray, it's an old industrial city, decrepit. It's no development. It's not like Warsaw or Krakow or Wrocław or something like that. It was a gray city, and we lived in a tenement. Well, for me, it was just looked great, but it was only 2 rooms. Now, in retro, when I started thinking, it were 2 rooms. The bedroom where my parents slept, then there was a small in-between room, and then there was a kitchen, which is a long and very narrow space. In that kitchen was a bathtub and a huge boiler for hot water, which was once actually exploded. And, this was our life, and we lived not just under communism, which was already dark enough, but under the even darker blow of anti-Semitism, social and political, against us. There were only a few Jews left. It's hard to believe anti-Semitism when there are no Jews. But we experienced it every day. And, I have an older sister, I have friends we all had the same experience. Nobody had a different experience. Even though we went to good schools, we had nice teachers, we had beautiful experiences, like in Wieliczka. I mean, that was the escape. If you left Łódź and you went down into the caves of the crystal mines, of the salt mines, and saw the Baroque churches carved in black lakes with reflection of white light. You could be really inspired, and in churches too. That was so inspiring. And but in life everything is strange, because my mother had a small shop. I mean, the shop was probably not bigger than these 3 objects in length and about this wide on Jaracza, a street close to where we live. And it was like a hovel, I would say. I went back there. I said, I can't believe I didn't remember how horrible this place was, because I thought it was kind of nice. My mother had her sewing machine. She was a seamstress, and she specialized in making brassieres and undergarments for women, because Poland after the war did not have such an industry. You couldn't buy it. Everything was just kind of socially central committee decisions what should be produced. Certainly not undergarments for women. So my mother opened this little store. She was a kind of fighter. She was a survivor, but she had an entrepreneurial spirit. And all I remember is police inside of that little store. 2 policemen, always dressed with the hats, the police, checking her manifest. Is it legally? Did she obtain the materials legally? Who is she selling it for? How much? Who are the people she's selling to? She was considered actually an enemy of the state. Prywatna inicjatywa. In Polish means private initiative. That was like a crime at that time, in the 50s. That was considered a crime against the state. State owned the job, state did it. If you departed into, quote, prywatna inicjatywa, you were already a suspect, and being Jewish, double suspect. So, this formed my, seeing the Singer sewing machine, which she had for many years, with the 1 needle, the way she threaded it, and the feet on that. Kind of a sound in my mind. It's the sound we don't hear anymore. Although when my mother worked in the sweatshops of New York, they had similar machines, a little more modern. The workers were not Jewish; they're mostly Vietnamese or people from Asia or somewhere. But it's in the dark parts of New York, which you don't see. Also kind of removed. So anyway, my childhood is full of these kinds of memories, which I never thematically thought about, but they must have had my repulsion to blobby forms. I mean, seeing my mother's this delicate materials flowing and the brassieres and all these girdles, that must have cured me forever from Zaha is brilliant. She's a brilliant architect, but she has another childhood.
Can I leap from that to what you made of your memories and your collective memories that you translated into the Jewish Museum, which I saw quite early on, empty. And I have to say, everybody I know, I mean, people who've seen it early and more recently, they all say that emptiness was one of the things that just absolutely kind of rang out. But can you talk a little bit about sort of what, if any of the process surprised you when you sort of were thinking of memory and that commission?
You know, I didn't ever go to a museum or an archive of a library to read about the Shoah, about the Holocaust. I have a big library. I never studied it. It was just part of my experience. And the experience was such that it was, you know, you walk with your father on streets which are not friendly to you because the way you look, because what you represent, and not very friendly. You walk alone, and sometimes somebody stops, and my father asks, "Amhu," which in Yiddish, Hebrew, means, "Are you Jewish?" And then they would break out into Yiddish, but most of the time it was another conversation. So I grew up in a void. It's true. There was nothing left. There was really nothing of, you know, if you think of the transformation of the world, I mean, we think of 6 million Jews. But think of the 50 million other people who perished as a result of the idea of exterminating the Jews. There's almost 60 million people, Russians, Poles, Czechs. You know, if you think of this catastrophe, and I recently read Derrida on it, and he said something interesting. He said, he was speaking actually about the Jewish Museum because he was in it, but he said this gave him the idea that the Holocaust, plus then soon after the bombing of Hiroshima, changed all architecture. Doesn't matter what it looks like, doesn't matter what style it is in, doesn't matter how far away it is from Europe or wherever, that the world has been affected in some way, which is ineffable. It's not easy to say exactly how has it been affected by these events, but it has, and I thought about it a lot. So when I, you know, was lucky or sort of surprisingly chosen to build what then became a Jewish museum. It did not start as a Jewish museum, you know that. The project, the competition was not for a Jewish museum. You know, I entered a competition which was called Competition for the Berlin Museum with a Jüdische Abteilung, containing a Jewish department. Now, when I saw that, you know, I was living in Milan at that time, something in my soul rebelled because Jüdische Abteilung, those words were invented by Adolf Eichmann, the Abteilung, to get rid of the Jews. And I said, you know, I'm going to participate in this competition, but I had no intentions to make a Berlin museum, which was 99% of the project. And then in the competition, there were about 200 architects from Israel and the United States, from all over the world, who made a big museum. And then in the museum, there was like a little room, like a synagogue-like room, which you open, and it was the Jüdische Abteilung. So I said, no, this cannot be done. I'm going to do something totally, there's nothing to do with Berlin, nothing to do with the theme of Berlin. So I created this other project, and that's why it had a difficult life. You know, it wasn't something that is just chosen and celebrated. And I want to remind, if there are architects here, that when I won the competition, it was amazing. The most important magazine of architecture in Germany, and we read a lot of magazines now, the thick magazine, Bauwelt, produced an issue with all the most famous historians, heads of museums, the most famous architects of Germany, critics of architecture, public figures. One after the other, do not build this museum. This museum should not be built. It cannot be built. If it's built, nobody's going to ever come. Nobody will understand it. So, you know, I was kind of lucky. I mean, not me, because I had Nina, who really, my wife and my partner, who should be credited with the political blood that boils in her veins. But in truth, you know, it was a project, and I never built anything before. It was a project that kind of changed the course because it wasn't a premeditated meditation on death, on memory, on Berlin, on the Jews at all. It was just my sort of architecture discourse, the intuitive discourse of creating a museum whose center you cannot enter. It has the void. It's a disconnected center, and it's not an atrium. It's just a sliver of disconnected spaces, And my idea in it was also to complete an opera. It was crazy because I was, as you know, in music, I wanted to complete a Schoenberg opera. Arnold Schoenberg, right, the famous Arnold Schoenberg, who later became Aaron Schoenberg when he was kicked out of Berlin, back to his kind of roots because he converted. He did everything that wanted to be part of the great German culture. Anyway, he wrote an opera, Moses and Aaron, which I highly recommend. It's very seldom performed because it's very difficult to assemble the cast. But it's a conversation with Moses and Aaron, the first 2 acts. And he never wrote the third one. He intended to. And it stops. There's an aporia when Moses calls to God. What does it all mean? And Schoenberg did not write further. No notes. But I thought I could make a building that completes this opera in the echoes of the footsteps of the visitors. As they walk across the void, it's an acoustical space, they will complete that. That was my idea. I mean, nobody has to know about it. But it's a kind of completion of something that began long before. So certainly, in my own experience, whether it's music, whether it's a certain, as Daniel Libeskind said, a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. You know, certain slant of light in the building, certain coldness in it, certainly that had a lot to do with kind of my experience. Because first of all, I never built a building before, not even a theoretical building, nothing. So this was my, and if you don't mind, I'll tell you one more anecdote, you might be interested. In Berlin, the most powerful person to decide what happens in the city is not the mayor. It's always the Bausenator, senator of building. They are the powers of Berlin, senator of building. And with each election comes a new senator. And there was a new election. I entered the competition, and I won it 1989, July 4th, American Independence Day. How strange. And then, in November, the wall fell. And a new government came to power. They had unification, Berlin is different. A new senator came to the helm, and his first act was to scrap all the projects of the previous government. It's normal. I remember him standing next to Stephen Hall. Stephen Hall didn't speak German. I spoke Yiddish. And Stephen was still smiling when the senator said, and we are not going to build the American Library in Berlin. And he was still smiling. And I sort of just scrapped the project. And he did it to everybody. And then I got a call. And the senator said, Senate of Berlin said, come to the offices of the senator at 7 o'clock at night. So I turned to her and I said, I have a meeting with the senator. She said, it's not a meeting. He's calling you to scrap the project. I said, but I won the competition. He said, it doesn't matter. He's just... So to make a long story short, I come to the Senate. All the bureaucracy of the Senate is there. They're all waiting for the senator. He comes very late. He's a small person with a trench coat. It's rainy. He comes... He's got a fierce face. He comes straight to me, doesn't shake my hand, he recognizes me. I'm the shortest one there. He just comes straight, and he puts his finger next to my face like this, and he says, what buildings did you build before? Just like that. And, I built nothing. Nobody ever asked me a question. I consider myself an architect. And then he said, even more aggressively, what big buildings did you do in your past, Mr. Libeskind, to qualify you to do this project? And then I said, Senator, if you're going to go by the past, Berlin is not going to have any future. So he stopped for a minute. Suddenly he stopped. It was not an expected answer.
Yeah.
And then there were like the 31st, top models of the competition, number 1, number 2, number 3. And he pointed at my model and he said to me, okay, how do I get into this building? And I said to him, Senator, there is no door in this building for you. Because the door is in the Baroque building, in the underground of the Baroque building. Because German history is not just visible, it's in the underground of Berlin. It's in the darkness of the Enlightenment. It's in the darkness of the subway system, which used Jewish cemetery stones to build, the infrastructure of Berlin after 1933. He stopped. He was about to do something, and then he just turned to me. He said, I welcome you to build this building in Berlin. That's my experience of Germany, which is something that people don't understand very well, because they still think of Germany like France or, like big history. But this kind of strange reversal, strange, powerful intellectual and also connections across a void, made me think very different and work very differently after that. Well, first of all, it was my first building. Who else would have allowed me to build a building? Nobody. Not in America, not in England, not in Italy.
That's a fantastic account. And I sort of want to take light on a bit, and I want to bring light. I want to bring Soane in just a little bit.
I love Soane.
And you did an exhibition at the
Yes.
Soane Museum, so you know the place and the idea of, I mean, his
Yes.
stamp on kind of architecture, the lumière mystérieuse, the idea that you go from dark into light and so on. I mean, did that, when you started sort of, when you went to install your exhibition and so on, I don't know if you knew it before, did that give you a...
No, I have the treatise of Soane. I bought it many years ago, hardcover, here in London. In fact, who else would sell it? Some Weinraub's? What is the name of that store? Weinraub's, the old Weinraub's.
Weinraub, yes, yeah.
No, I love Soane. He's a master, like all the great architects, are masters with light. And I mean, I'm not a theoretician, and never really was, but light is something, you know, which I understood from the very beginning of doing my first building, was the key to architecture and to remembrance. And I tell you another anecdote. You know, when you enter the underground, there are 3 roads. He says one goes to the Garden of Exile, one goes to the exhibitions, kind of hope, and one goes to a dead end. The Holocaust, they call it our Holocaust Tower. And I worked for all these years on the building, and it was just a tower with no light. And I said, you know, nobody can bring light to the Holocaust. There's no light. Doesn't matter what you say. Doesn't matter what you do. It's a dark. There's nothing. You just let people go to a dead end, which is completely dark. And it was like that till the last minute when the building was under construction. And by coincidence, I read an account of a survivor, a total coincidence, a survivor who was talking in Brooklyn now. And she was saying to an interviewer that when she was locked in the cattle cars, you know, taken to Stutthof concentration camp, she said, I saw a line of light. And I looked at it. And then she said, she was in Brooklyn, she was in her 70s when she was saying this. She said, I saw a line of light. And she said, I don't remember whether it was maybe a crack in the car that I was looking through, or maybe through the crack I saw a plume, white plume of smoke from an airplane. But whatever it was, I held on to it. And she says, I attribute my survival to holding onto the light. So then I said, I'm going to cut a piece of light. And I, at the last minute, cut this in this oblique point at the upper edge of the tower. I cut a light which actually doesn't fall into the ground. It just reflects itself against another wall. But that was kind of my transformation in a way, because I really didn't see light. And then this account gave me light. And then I understood that without hope, you can't build anything. You might as well not bother building anything.
I think it's very fascinating to think about memory in terms of sort of in a temporal sense, and wonder your museum. I mean, you know, that particular little anecdote, you know, it's a wonderful shines, you know, if I can use it, the light into something. I mean, how are we going to use memory to give that museum in particular the resonance it needs way beyond all our natural lifespans? How does that work?
Well, first of all, you can't think of just a contemporary audience. But I always thought of, you know, who are you building for? Is it, you know, for the critics? Is it for the Senate of Berlin? Is it, you know, who's your client? Client is someone else, some stranger who's coming, who doesn't know anything about anything. He's just hasn't even been in the city. He doesn't speak the language. He's a foreigner. He's an immigrant. He's a refugee or somebody. That's who I think of myself. And when I was actually working at Ground Zero, I had a very similar revelation as that story. But this happened actually to me more viscerally. You know, at Ground Zero, when I became the master planner, there was a competition. At the final stage, there were 7 architects. And we were all in one Liberty Plaza, which is a big skyscraper standing right over Ground Zero, which was there before and still there. That's where the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation had its offices. And we were all standing, all 7 finalists, on a grim, dark November day. And somebody said, from the Port Authority, who owns the site, does anybody want to go down to the site? And all the architects unanimously said, no, it's much better to see it from here. We can see, clearly the complete plan, everything around it, the context, the best view. But something told me, no, I want to go to see it. Nina, let's go to, with these galoshes, you buy these cheap galoshes, you get the umbrellas. And I have to tell you, when we walked down that ramp, that's, which you remember seeing when the wall was still there, the slurry wall, 75 feet down, and I touched that ground, my life changed. I understood that everything that I had been doing, it was completely off, nothing to do with it. Not about buildings, not about skyscrapers. It was about that ground. And I touched that wall, by coincidence, and the engineer said to me, that's the slurry wall, the guy from Port Authority. And even though I studied architecture, I didn't really know technically what a slurry wall is, but it's a huge dam. On one side is the pressure of the Hudson River, and he said, this wall, if it had collapsed, all the subways, because it's all infrastructure, would have been just flooded with ocean, with the waters of the Hudson. And then I said, I don't have a cell phone, but Nina always does one. I said, we were still based in Berlin. I said, please give me the phone. We got to call Berlin. In Berlin, it was like 4 o'clock in the morning. But somebody picked up the phone. And I said, forget the models, forget all the studies. It's a completely different project. It's nothing to do with the buildings. And really, I suggested in the plan not to put anything in the vast center of the site, not to build anything. Instead of mega structures, large building, impressive building, put nothing there. Create a public realm, create memory, create something that goes to bedrock. And I was very moved just recently, a couple of weeks ago, I was with the Pope and religious leaders from around the world. And he was sitting, he chose to give a speech at the slurry wall. He could have spoken anywhere, to New Yorkers about interfaith and a world of ecumenical tolerance. But he chose. He's a very smart Pope. He chose to be at the bedrock against that wall. And I thought, this is right. This is really not just a memorial. It's about the people of New York. And quite frankly, my whole plan evolved as I thought of my parents. My parents worked in factories, in sweatshops. My father and mother's combined income was, I don't know how many dollars. It was kind of, when I look at it, I don't understand how they lived with 2 kids on very, low income in a public housing project. And I thought to myself when I was doing Ground Zero, let's forget the people who are going to be lucky to, work for Time Magazine or Condé Nast or Fox News. What do New Yorkers get for this project? They're never going to be in these buildings. They're going to be in the subways, on the streets. They should get beautiful streets. They should get an open public space that is beautiful to be in. They should get low buildings, as low as I could make them. So instead of making 1 big tower or 2 big towers, I divided to 5 towers so they could be descendingly small in order to keep the streets without the wind tunnels. The tall buildings are not that healthy for nice streets. So I did everything from the point of view, kind of my imaginary point of view of what would my father, who worked around, on Stone Street as a printer, what would he think of what would he want to see on Ground Zero? Certainly not the gleaming buildings. I love gleaming buildings, and they're fantastic, and by great architects. But I thought it was about the realm of the public. And by the way, out of the 16 acres, I have to say 8 acres are open public space, which is a lot in New York, because I introduced extra public space. I did the Wedge of Light, which is another public space, which no one even wanted in New York. They said, we don't need an extra public. I said, yeah, New Yorkers need the more public space, the better for people in this dense part of the city. And I was right, because 100,000 people have moved to Lower Manhattan. That's the proof.
So do you think there's an element of memory used to heal?
Definitely.
Something like this?
Oh, definitely. I think, if you forget your memory, if you have a trauma and you repress it, it's going to come to haunt you. It's going to do something to you, something bad, something violent at some point. And there is a lot of repression. Architecture is a field of repression. You repress almost everything to produce a building. Everything is repressed because it has to fit into the context. It has to be stylized. It has to appeal to clients. It has to be normal. But I always thought, try to show what has been repressed in architecture. It's very difficult because people don't like it. When I did it, when I suggested to the Senate of Berlin to make the void, they said, and I said, don't heat it in the winter and don't cool it in the summer, just a space. They said, that's not a museum, Mr. Libeskind. We're paying for a museum. A museum is not an empty space of concrete wall. But I said, but you need it. You need it. And they kind of at the end, even though they were very hesitant about it for a very long time, why are we building a space that we can't hang any exhibitions, we can't have any exhibitions? Why are we building it? Somehow they viscerally thought, maybe it's not such a bad idea. Let's try it out. And I think it's important not to repress the trauma. It's important to express it. And sometimes the violence of a building is not something comforting. It should not be comforting. Why should it be comfort? We should not be comfortable in this world. I mean, seeing what's going around. And Rilke, one of my favorite German poets said, if you stand on the ground and don't feel that you're rotating on a sphere across the darkness of the cosmos, you're asleep. So I'm always surprised that people think architecture should be comforting, should be nice, should appeal to your domesticity because space and the world is different. And architecture is always telling a story, in my view. It's a storytelling thing.
We were saying, I think you and I beforehand, that the Nabokov
Yes.
quote that's used here, the more you love a memory, the stronger and stranger it becomes.
That's true.
I think that's the most wonderful evocation of how memory turns on itself. And I mean, we're talking in the week of everybody's left mine behind, but we're wearing our poppies to commemorate that.
Yes.
My father was in the trenches, so it's very real to me. That's my, it's a mark. And what do we do with all these memories, except sort of just embed ourselves in the lessons?
Right. And you're right. Because without memory, we would be in a home for the people who suffer from Alzheimer's, people who have dementia. They have no memory. They can act, they can eat, they can do things. But it's the memory that gives us the orientation generally, not just about the world, but how do we fit into this world? What do we do in this world? And to me, the memory is not really an extra dimension, make something memorable like quotation. Now, I love Soane because Soane created a certain quotation idea of the memory. But I think memories, as Nabokov says very well, it gets stranger because it's really not quotable. You can transmit it. And by the way, all oppressive regimes and all dictators, Nazis, Russians, communists, try to wipe out memory. That's Mao. The first thing they do is try to get rid of everything. Now, I'm building a building, my first building in China, which is a first privately funded museum of Chinese history. It's not a government building. On the site are some old factories. It's in Wuhan, and it's a museum of Zhang Zhidang. He's like around the Xinhai Revolution. He thought, China needs to get rid of the colonial powers, needs to learn how to make steel, heavy industry. He bought it from Luxembourg, whole factories, and it was amazing. His tomb, by the way, was desecrated during the Cultural Revolution. He was considered a horrible. But there were some buildings on the site in Wuhan, old buildings, old industrial buildings, which were still used when I was there some years ago. And I said, keep them. And they said, it's going to be very difficult. We have to, get rid of them. We're going to build housing blocks. I say you have to keep them because without memory, people themselves don't know where they're going. And you're right. I think loss of memory is a terrible thing that happens. If you have elderly parents or people who have lost memory, or people who have mechanical memory is also terrible. Do you know the books by Luria? There is a Russian psychologist working in the 40s in Moscow. He wrote 2 books. One called The Man, it's about men without memory, and one about a man who could not forget anything. Two injured people, soldiers, Russian front. One who did not know anything, did not know where he came from, what part of Russia. And what did Dr. Luria said? He said, every day said, write just one word down, anything. So like a cup of water. After many years, this man, and Luria's genius, assembled kind of a story, with all these words, like the cards of Nabokov, for writing. He suddenly rediscovered where he was from. Remember, the man who could not forget is equally strange, a man who remembered everything. He couldn't forget anything. He remembered every number, every person he met, every conversation, literally. And that was even more difficult to cure.
Is that not the Soane Museum?
Yes. Soane could need a Dr. Luria. Yes, definitely.
There is nothing in that house that does not have an association.
Absolutely.
And there it is, frozen by Act of
It's
Parliament
fantastic. Well,
in his memory.
Yes.
I have to ask you, would you ever do such a thing?
No, I couldn't do such a thing. But that's also the genius of Soane, that he took a psychiatric disease and carried it into, emancipated himself. No,
Yes,
really, in some way.
yes,
I mean,
yeah.
I don't know his personal life. I didn't know about his wife and his son, none of it. But he emancipated himself by being a great artist, by doing such an amazing building that when I came to London first, many, many years ago, 1970, the first place I went was the Soane Museum. I knew about the British Museum. I knew but I wanted to see the Soane because I read about it in a book. And I said, I've got it. And I've been, of course, every architect loves that building.
But that is memory taken, I mean, as you were pointing out, that's memory taken to a complete extreme.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it sort of ceases, the creative process freezes. I mean,
Yes.
because he did it so late, it's the end.
Yes.
And then you have the strange tomb, and with 3 sides for the family he was prepared to talk to, and himself.
But you bring up an interesting topic, how memory can also free you. Because, I started music on this strange piano in the suitcase. And I have to tell you, those of you who don't know the story, because, I was doomed to play the accordion. I want to play the piano, but because we were Jews and we lived in a tenement with our neighbors very hostile to us, that we still remained alive, my parents said, we cannot bring the piano to the courtyard. We're too scared of our neighbors. The Jews cannot bring a piano to the courtyard. So my father came with a suitcase. He said, I got the piano. And I looked, I was a kid, and it looked like a piano, but strange, very strange, with kind of and so I played this instrument. I became a virtuoso on this instrument. I played classical music. I didn't play, folk music on it, ever. And when I came to Israel, somebody said, why don't you, and they heard me play, they said, why don't you enter the America-Israel Prize for Music? I said, great. I walk into a room, it's a room with hundreds of young people, from young to 18-year-olds, 21-year-olds, cellos, violins, flutes, oboes, voice, everybody's practicing. And I'm there with my father in a suitcase. Then my name is called. My name is called from the back. And my father carries it was too heavy for me to even lift it. Carries it back there. The door closes, and I see 3 faces, very perplexed. They're looking at me. I open the suitcase. The accordion was bigger than the one is here by probably 1.5 octaves. And I was even shorter, I think. And I strapped it on, and I saw the faces of Zino Francescatti, one of the great violinists, virtuosos, Mrs. Kusevitsky, the wife and patron of music of Sarge Kusevitsky, who was the founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. First to perform Prokofiev, first to perform, the great, Stravinsky and so on. And the face of Isaac Stern, who I didn't know any of them. He was the head of the jury. And I saw quizzical expressions like, this is, what the hell is happening here? Why is this person in our room? But I have to tell you, I think the first 4 chords of the toccata in D minor, which on an accordion sounds actually pretty much almost like a small harpsichord, their expression changed. They suddenly became serious. And I played several pieces of music, and I finished with my most fantastic piece, which is the Flight of the Bumblebee, because it shows the kind of the technical dexterity, virtuosity. And I saw them smiling. They all stood up. They shook my hand. And Isaac Stern, he was a very nice person. He took me, I put the accordion, he took me to the side of the room, and he said, Mr. Libeskind, you've exhausted all the possibilities of this instrument. Now you have to play the piano. Well, it's very difficult to go from the vertical to the horizontal. And I consider myself lucky, because had I played the piano, I would have never been an architect. Had I played the piano, I would have never done architecture. So how lucky. This whole story that brought me to the point that I could become an architect and have so much fun and do so many things.
But there's also another connection, because music, Claire and I were talking before, music in dementia sufferers releases language when it's completely lost in the ordinary day-to-day life. So music is frees memory, takes memory back, brings things to the surface. So,
yes. In fact, I had an idea, which, I was invited by the city of Frankfurt to do something for the city. And Germany is an incredible place. The intendant of the Frankfurt Opera, which is like the Lincoln Center of Frankfurt, Mr. Pauli, Dr. Pauli, I said to him, "You're asking me to do something. What did you do before?" And he said, I'm a theologian, but I became an intendant for music. I love music. What would you like to do in the city? So I had an idea instantly. I said, let's have one day, 24 hours of music in Frankfurt, but 24 hours of music based on the 18 dimensions of the human soul, like idleness, imagination, will. I mean, I invented 18. And let's have them 24 hours, because it's a good number. It's a good number. For 24 hours, and let's put them in places where music has never been played, like in an insane asylum, inside of an underpass that is noisy. And let me choose the music. It's always classical music. It's not, fusion music. Always classic, contemporary, and ancient. And they kind of agreed to do it. And it's going to happen in May of next year. May when? May 20th. And I said to him, who's crazy enough to go for 24 hours and enter like a bunker that has been closed since 1945? He said, don't worry, this is Germany. People will come.
So when you do that, are you an architect? Are you a musician? Are you impresario?
No, not an impresario. Actually, it's the connection between architecture and music. They're connected in space. They're connected in their key. They're a key to the city, and the city where you live is also an unknown topography of music that is also part of your daily experience. So it's kind of a cross-section of a day in the life of a normal person.
Yes.
And I think it's going to be very interesting, because people are used to, let's say, hearing, Franz Liszt played on a piano in a beautiful hall with great acoustics. But if you play Liszt transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which, to my knowledge, only Glenn Gould played fully, in a surgical ward, wow, that's where it should be played. So, yeah, I don't think I abandoned music. I don't, many people ask me, so why did you give up music? I really don't feel it.
No, I think it's fascinating. Music's found you. Again.
Well, I never gave it up, because architecture is, it's almost a cliche to say proportions, Pythagorean, relationship between strings and golden section. We know the whole history of music, but the enigma of music being kind of something that evaporates and moves you, and the enigma of architecture, which is so stable and can move you in a complete different way, connects those two arts. And even just the scores. One of my first projects before I had any commissions was what I call chamber works. It's a series of drawings. I didn't have any client. I don't like imaginary buildings. I don't like fantasy buildings that are not going to be built without a social context, without any budget. Why bother making a fantasy, something? So I drew my scores, architectural scores. I call them chamber works. They were maddening to many people, because they thought it's a bunch of lines, a bunch of curves, but to me, they were really architectural drawings. And strangely enough, I have used these drawings subsequently for very technical reasons. They're obscure on the surface, but they are very technical drawings for architecture.
I think it's time that somebody started asking questions of you who isn't me. So,
thank you.
Shall we open the event to the room.
More than ever, as we have, radical things happening in this world, that the world is threatened. It's like the first scene in Hamlet. Bernardo stands in a dark, there's a castle, it's the middle of the night, it's cold, there is a war going on, and he says, who's there? That's the world today, and memory is there. And I think it's not just generalized memory. You see pictures, you see things that are happening, you see your neighbors. It is about memory, because that's what keeps us human. Without this, I think, and by the way, it's not necessary to do a museum to express that. I did a house recently, my first house. I never had a client for a house. It's because I was not, nobody came. I had a big project, but somebody said a couple came to me and said, "Would you like to do our house? We'd like, we're art collectors. We have, you're already a great residence in New York, but we'd like a house that is a work of art for us." And they were kind of experts on architecture and art. And it was in Connecticut. It's about an hour. It's a greenfield site, beautiful, like a freestanding site, create. And I thought a lot about the house. Of course, it has to function excellently for the client. But other than memory, what happened on this site? Native peoples were in Connecticut. Now, there's a lot of history. It looks nice and green, but there's a lot underneath it. A lot of ghosts, like in Hamlet, are haunting. So my form of the building is very unusual for a house, I think. I was lucky that they liked it. It's very sharp. It's stainless steel. It's a monocoque construction. It doesn't have any columns. It's a folded, radical, violent form. But inside I created like a fireplace, kind of a cabin, a log cabin. Anyway, to answer your question, I think it's very important, memory. I think without it, it's a city that doesn't mean much. Sure, we can functionalize anything. My son is a theoretical astrophysicist. He tells me that, the Earth will be extinguished. It's not a if, it's just a matter of calculation. Stephen Hawking, who was his professor, suggests that we should emigrate to other planets. He's a Nobel Prize mega mind. He's saying, he's occupying Newton's chair, in Cambridge. He's saying we've got no chance in this world. We've got to start, interstellar travel. We start, hoping for time dilation and, all sorts of things. But I think he's wrong. I really think, I'm sorry, the Professor Hawking. I think he's wrong because my belief is that people haven't even discovered this world. They have lived, they've abused, they've lived on Earth for a relatively short time, but they have no idea. There should be a space exploration program for the Earth, really, and that's memory. That's memory. I was really lucky to meet her. Believe me, I was really lucky. And I have to, I'm always kind of in the front, and I often introduce you. Here's Mr. Libeskind. She's the woman behind the man. She's beside me. She is an equal partner. She's not just doing some administration and banking and stuff like that. She is a creative person, and her abilities. And I'm not saying this to embarrass her. Are abilities which I don't, which I don't have. I would not be able to speak to many of the people that are necessary to be spoken to get their job. I don't have those abilities.
She can remember where you were yesterday.
That's right, and I couldn't remember it. You're right. So how did I meet her? Believe it or not, when I was 17, 18, I was a counselor in a summer camp. And I was the head of the arts and crafts for kids. And it was a very unusual summer camp called Hemshech, which in Yiddish and Hebrew means continuity. It was a summer camp for children of Holocaust survivors, and the language of the camp was Yiddish. There was no English spoken. It was a crazy thing. A half an hour from New York to have 250 kids speaking Yiddish, like, across the void, across the ocean, all kids of survivors. And by a good luck, a friend of hers, her mother was a survivor. Nina's parents luckily were not survivors. Told her, "Come with me. There's this, this strange camp with people speaking this foreign language. Maybe you'll find somebody interesting there." Well, that's how I met her. Am I missing anything?
Not exactly.
But it's great to have a partner that you can travel with, that is tougher on you than any of the critics. Then it's not architect. She's not an architect. And I think, in the beginning, I have to tell you this story because most architects associate with other architects. But I discovered, when Nina, when we were in Berlin, and I quote won the competition, we decided to stay in Berlin. And I said to her, we had other plans. As long as you join me together, we'll be here together. And she said very memorable words to me. She said, "I can't. I've never even been to architect's office." And I said, the same applies for me. I think I worked for one day for Richard Meyer, for one day for Peter. I worked and I didn't like it too much. I said, this is not that interesting for me. So I said, we both have no idea what they do in architecture. Because so much of it is such a myth, it's such a myth how architecture is produced. It's got a big facade. People think it's some sort of inevitable thing, but somebody's doing something to create these beautiful buildings or ugly buildings or beautiful cities or bad neighborhoods. Somebody's doing it. So anyway, it was kind of learning by a partnership of ignorance. I was at the site with all the architects, and everybody was photographing the site. It's still before the iPhone, so the big cameras. All the architects, seemingly hundreds of cameras, different angles, And I walked, I had nothing. I didn't want to have I would never have thought of taking a picture of that site. Never would have thought. I just thought, what's lying? Where is the site? What has transpired across the site? When I started working, I got myself 2 volumes printed by the federal German government called the Gedenkbuch. The Gedenkbuch is 2 volumes, each one thousands of pages, listing every name of every German Jew, showing the name, when they were born, when they were arrested or deported, and presumed dates of death or extermination. The 2 volumes, they're this thick, each one, black, with silver lettering on top, saying Gedenkbuch, memory book. So I started saying, I'm going to look up the name Berlin, because a lot of Jews take the name of the city. So most people whose name is Berlin were Jews. Oh. And I started saying, where did this first person, Berlin, live? And started plotting a map of as many names as I could, starting with the name Berlin. And then I started making, lines between the names. Who were they married to? Both metaphorically, symbolically, and practically. Many were married to non-Jews, to Christians, to Protestants, to others. And I created this emblematic map that was the matrix from which I created the building, which has a kind of a star, distorted star within it. And I cannot say that I used hundreds of thousands of names, but I certainly was implicated in thousands of names, thousands of dots. And to bring the story to the present about memory, ground zero, when I first started working on the project, 2 men came over to me. It was still the competition. And they introduced themselves. One was the father of a fireman who perished, and one was the father of a flight attendant on one of those flights. And they unrolled a big piece of paper on it. And it literally had thousands of red dots. I have no idea. Were they lunatics? What are we trying to show me? They said, no, this is a map of all the body parts that were found. And there was just a sea of, but we don't think about it. We don't want to think about it because that's what happened. But I had a similar feeling then as I had in Berlin, that it's not only the visible apparent history that you can photograph, but it's the not apparent history, which has to do with people whose voices are still there. When you go to Berlin, I love Berlin, but it's a strange city because you hear voices that whisper to you. Doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. You get a connection somehow, even across the beautiful new buildings, new streets. You get a connection. There's always a voice whispering somewhere, if we listen to it. So I believe that's not a mystical method. It's a very practical method. And I try to use it in projects in different ways. It's not so applicable everywhere in the same way, but I try to kind of use that as a technique. It's the same as when I designed it, except I like the fact that my client, Jewish Museum Berlin, asked me to do 2 more projects. First, I did the glass court in the Baroque building, because when the original project was, they thought nobody would be ever eating in this museum. Nobody would ever come to socialize. It was just a museum. But as the people began to come, and it's actually one of the most popular museums in Berlin, although it doesn't really have any remarkable collections of old art or anything like that. So they asked me, so when a client comes back, that's an affirmation that the museum is working. People are coming. And also then I was asked to do an extension in the old Blumenhalle, the flower market, which is across the street, with these kind of 3 crates of wood that I put into it. One is an archive, a library, a place for people to come together. It's a different kind of facility, on which, by the way, I was able to install my own, quote, work of art, which is a kind of the underground geometry of the Jewish Museum on top of the building, but it's in writing. And the writing is a quote from Maimonides, Moses Maimonides, who lived 1,000 years ago, who wrote in Arabic, and then Judeo-Arabic, and I have it also in German and in English. And the quote is, "Hear the truth, whoever speaks it." It's a mystical, it's a very rational quote, but also something startling, because who's the audience passing the building now? It's Kreuzberg, it's Turks, it's immigrants from Syria, it's not Jews, it's just Berlin. It's the beauty of Berlin. So yeah, if a client comes back to you, you feel good. And even in my Nussbaum, small museum which I built, the client came, can you do a coffee and a shop for books? We didn't think we needed it in the beginning. So to tell you the truth, I like that there are a lot of young people, young kids, and when they ran the surveys, I was told by Dr. Blumenthal, who was the CEO of the museum, they run surveys, why do you come to the museum? He said 50-50. 50% say because they are interested in Jewish history and German history. 50% say they want to see the building. So, okay, that's it's still working. And I'm also very pleased that it was adopted by the federal government as one of the federal projects, like the Berlin Symphony Orchestra, like the Opera House. So it's an ambassador also of Berlin's government, politics, to the world, that this is Berlin developing, but we are also aware. We are working on this theme. It's not just a rhetoric. And so I'm very glad that people are coming. And they are redoing the exhibitions. The Senate of Berlin appropriated how much? 23 million euro to redo the exhibitions, which I think is great, because I feel like many people, the exhibitions came after. They were not sort of...
Do you have any hand in it?
I recommended a few great designers that worked with me, particularly in museum world. The Senate chooses it. I don't have much influence.
I think we have to have a glass of wine, and I think we have to say thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have just had a wonderful time.
Likewise. Thank you so
much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.